When I was a kid, I was always intrigued by inventors. And the nice thing about blacksmithing is you get to invent every day. You're problem solving and you're inventing new jigs, you're inventing new tools, you build your own tools. And that part of it that's the most enjoyable part. You come up with the design and then you solve the problems to make it a reality. It's inventing on a small scale compared to the people that, I admired growing up, but it's a constant mental challenge. Traveled around a lot as a kid. My father was career Army, and when I was about 12 years old, we were at Fort Rucker, and he decided to retire. So he bought a farm because he'd spent some time as a kid on a farm, and we retired south of Montgomery to a little town of Raymer, Alabama. I kind of consider that home, the longest we were ever in one place. My mother was more of an artistic talent. She was a pretty good painter, and loved to sew, and did outfits for theaters and just a little of everything. Did my father's officers' uniforms and that kind of stuff, and she kind of instilled in us, kind of a love for art. As a kid, my heroes were always people who invented, because the things they came up with seemed just so obvious and such, wonderful solutions to problems. And that always intrigued me, is how can you come up with these solutions and where could you work? So as I worked my way through college, I worked at Jackson Hospital. And so the medical end just seemed to be a natural fit. And it's a real problem-solving field, real calculated field. As I was finishing up college, my original intent was to go to medical school. And I went through the procedures and took the MCATs and applied. And as I got closer to it and things were kind of falling into place, it just became more apparent that it wasn't going to be a good fit, and it wasn't what I wanted to spend the rest of my life doing. So I just didn't know what I wanted to do at that point. And a company came through town, and they were hiring for a wagon train. And this wagon train traveled up and down the West Coast. And the whole purpose of the wagon train was to treat juvenile delinquents. Most of them were gang kids out of California. And I thought either that or go to the Peace Corps, spend a year, figure out my life, and come back and do it. I ended up picking the wagon train so I could stay in the States and work with our kids. And ended up spending almost 4 years there. There was a lot of practical metalworking on the wagon train. She had a horseshoer on the staff. And so, you've got some real basic elements of blacksmithing there. Where I really got a real feel for more contemporary work was a guy who was actually an artist for the program we worked for, named Jan Pearson. He had such skill working with iron. And at that point in time, blacksmithing was still an re-emerging craft. It had died out probably in the 1920s. As cast iron in the industrial age kind of just squeezed it out. It just had no usefulness. Back in the 70s and 80s, it started getting a real basic revival. During the same time, one Christmas, my brother sent me a book on Foxfire, called Foxfire, which dealt with primitive blacksmithing, and it was more of a documentary type book. Well, the thing I remember most about the Foxfire book was that there were some blacksmiths from the Appalachians and down in Georgia, and the part I remember the most was they were making rifle barrels. And the whole process was real intriguing because they didn't have any machines like we've got today. The amount of labor would have been tremendous. They went through step by step, and these old timers went through and told you exactly how they did it. And the whole thing was just so much common sense. Not a lot of engineering, not a lot of schoolwork. An anvil and a hammer and a file. It's pretty amazing that these people, given their situation, could turn out this complex machinery. That's when I decided when I returned home I would just give it a shot and see what I could do. When I first got to Montgomery, I had a basic understanding of blacksmithing, very basic, and an even less basic knowledge of metalwork. And a lot of it was just reading books. Edge of the Anvil was a really important book in the revival of blacksmithing, and it was written by a guy named Jack Andrews, who worked in the shop of what was the heirs of a real famous American blacksmith named Samuel Yellen. So he had access to a lot of stuff, and he presented the book in a real basic platform on here's the basic techniques, and here's the most advanced work you could ever do, and you can bridge the gap. And it was a lot of it was just bridging the gap. And his book was real important for a lot of people. At that point in time, which was the early 1990s, downtown Montgomery had this little underground art scene going on. There were a lot of artists living downtown. There were a couple galleries popping up. And there was just this real positive downtown vibe that it was a real creative place to be. There were a few guys painting. There was a potter. You had a lot of people just hanging out and just had a little bit of a scene to it. You had some musicians, and some of the guys were living in warehouses. And at that time, living in the warehouses was illegal because of the fire laws. So that gave it a little element of intrigue, and you never knew when the fire marshal was going to show up and evict everybody from their houses. And basically it was just a group of folks, kind of getting out of the mainstream. And unfortunately, as the whole thing just kind of died out. Gallery closed, and the warehouses got bought, and people just moved on. And I just kind of hung here and just stuck it out. There was a fellow here named Wayne Pelham doing woodwork, and he had just acquired the building and needed somebody to share it with, so I decided it'd be a good place to get started. And I had an anvil from when I was out west, and it just gave me a good platform to start experimenting with. I think when I started, it was about making functional objects, but the biggest thing was, my biggest goal was to have more of a continuous creative outlet. So I didn't want to get into the factory work of just turning out the same object time and time again. I didn't want to find that one widget that I could make 1,000,000 of and get rich. I'd rather make 1,000 different widgets and explore the medium and explore the field. It's always been pretty self-sufficient since coming out, since day one, but it's involved more industrial work or more straightforward interior design work, doing other people's designs. And I think if anything's been progress, it's been working toward doing my own designs and working toward more adventuresome pieces is my ultimate goal, is just to produce our own pieces that have, our signature on them. There's a little bit of a disadvantage. Montgomery's a little bit out of the mainstream of, Santa Fe or New York or, where a lot of stuff is happening, but there's still resources that could get you there. Once, of course, the internet arrived, then it was, like a whole new world. A guy in Montgomery, Alabama like me can get an international face and an international presence just by having a website and promoting yourself. The internet has made the biggest change in business for people like us of anything that could happen. Now we've evolved to the point we send work pretty much all over the United States, a little bit out of the country, but that's taken a lot of time. It's pretty physical work. I enjoy balancing the physical part of the job with the mental part of the design work. I would not enjoy just sitting at a drafting table, coming up with solutions to problems. that then you couldn't implement the solutions. I think it's real important that I've got my hand in it all the way through, and it's, here's the design problem, here's the solution, and here's the product. And that to me is real fulfilling. When you spend a day at the coal forge and that heat's radiating on you and you've picked up the energy of the fire, the radiation that comes out of it is really, you get in tune with it and you get lost in your work. And that's the best part. That's the best part of a day in a blacksmith shop, is when you can fire up the forge and you can spend 2 or 3 hours or 8 or 9 hours and you can just become completely lost. You'll never think about anything, but you're just in just a little trance going through it, and it's just enjoyable. It's kind of a 2,000-degree yoga. The safety it's ingrained, and a lot of it, you just learn the hard way. When you've got a big piece of steel like that 1/2 by 6 and you've heated up 2 or 3 feet of it, that's a big potential accident. So you do have to be careful. When you're working like I work with Mark, we've got a real good rapport. We don't have to do a lot of instructing, and we kind of understand how the material is going to be worked. It's very unforgiving. People die when they work under these hammers, and parts fly out. And back in the early 1900s, it was just a fact of life. And hopefully that's one thing 100 years later, maybe we've gotten a little bit more aware of personal safety. We've got a line of drapery products, and that's a real steady stream. Furniture and lighting, interior lighting and furniture is another big one. And that's probably 60 or 70% overall of everything. I like to work on at least one larger scale outdoor project at a time. I don't like to get flooded with them. I like to just be able to concentrate on one at a time and get those going. So generally over the course of a year, we'll turn out 2 or 3 physically large projects. And they could be our post and beam, post and steel banded mailboxes and signage, a public sculpture, anything along that lines. The small power hammer I went to Florida and found. We actually traced its history back. It was sold in, I believe it was April 14th of 1912 to a farmer in Kansas. So we've got a pretty good documented history on that machine. The large hammer was salvaged out of an old factory by a fellow in Wisconsin named Bob Bergman, who then he rebuilds just that specific type of Nazel hammer. And I went to Wisconsin and picked that hammer up from him. The big hydraulic press was actually found right down the road in a foundry, and along with the big drill press. We're actually just a couple of miles down the road. Actually drove them down here on a forklift and cleaned them up and put them to work. The older machines actually function a little bit better. They don't have some of the advantages of new technology, but what they do have is mass, and that's real important in metalwork. The big power hammer we have up there weighs over 10,000 pounds. It's almost 11,000 pound machine. When you're hammering steel, you need something that doesn't move, and 10,000 pounds just doesn't move a lot, and it hits with a lot of force. So that becomes real important. And the newer machines, they don't offer that much mass. They don't have the precision valving. And it's a little bit of a trade-off. You give up available parts, so you give up some of the conveniences of the new stuff. But there's also a beauty to the design of them. They're elegantly designed. Even back in the early 1900s, there was a real focus on the aesthetics of the machine as well as the function of the machine. the water gets real muddy when you get into that argument of art versus craft. And if I just pick one, I'm really more of a craftsman. Utilitarian items, even though they have an artistic edge, I like to blend the two. What I do still mainly revolves around functional items. And if we can put an artistic edge to it and intrigue people a little bit, or make them think, or even make a statement with it, that's fine, but it's still a craft-oriented thought process for me.